Welcome everyone. Je vous remercie d'être venu aujourd'hui. I want to say thank you for joining us here at Courage Ottawa for this panel discussion about electing socialists and how to engage with our writing associations. We've already heard a few little candid tidbits from our panelists, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more as we get going. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Courage Ottawa's work takes place on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We ground the work that we do here at Courage Ottawa in anti-capitalist and anti-colonial politics, which means that every action we take, including webinars like this one, must center the goal of dismantling colonial and capitalist structures. We acknowledge that making the choice to reform colonialist structures from within is not without its incredibly valid and valuable criticisms. We also believe that engaging with electoral politics and reforming institutions from within can be useful tools in the fight for a just and equitable society. Putting in place truly progressive policies that stop the violent oppression of Black, Indigenous peoples, and people of color is an especially urgent task. It is from this perspective that we look to the structures and tools available to us within the Canadian electoral system. We don't believe the fight is over when we elect a progressive candidate or see more anti-colonialist policies adopted. Our goal is not to reduce oppression, our goal is to eliminate oppression. Electoral politics is not our end goal, but it can be a useful tool in our fight against colonialism and capitalism. How we might use this tool of electoral politics and how we understand the limits of its use are key themes of this evening's discussion. Tonight, we will explore the writing association, or as we define it, a possible entry point into the broader realm of party politics. We hope that this discussion can spark a critical examination of the ways socialists engage with electoral politics, as well as generate important future debates around other transformational strategies, both within and without the electoral system. My name is Emily Quayle, and I am a member of Courage Ottawa, which is a local chapter of the national organization. A member-based organization, Courage is a coalition of the independent left that attempts to bridge the divide between movement and electoral politics. For more information about Courage and our basis of unity, you can visit couragecoalition.ca. Here at Courage Ottawa, we have been working to develop initiatives that engage with electoral politics directly and indirectly. This webinar's goal is to create a space where activists can share their experiences engaging with electoral politics and party structures. Not only is this an educational tool for all of us here, but hopefully something that can help us delineate a strategy for future elections. Each electoral district brings with it a very unique context. Whether your riding is rural or urban, whether there is an elected MP or MPP, or if there's a hope in hell in getting a progressive candidate elected, let alone a socialist, these contexts and differing histories will inform how we engage with our EDAs. Our panelists are bringing with them NDP and Ontario-specific lessons, but we view all these lessons as a jumping off point to engage with your own local activists and riding associations. Briefly, I will give you a definition of the riding associations, also known by their official name, electoral district associations, or EDAs. At its most basic, the EDAs are the local chapters of the national party. The NDP's constitution defines them as the primary organization through which the rights of the members of the party are exercised. Each electoral district association can submit resolutions to be tabled at the policy convention and send delegates to that convention. The Riding Association also holds the nomination processes for candidates in upcoming elections. The Riding Association is registered with Elections Canada, and its financial duties, such as campaign contributions, are regulated by that body. So while in many ways the EDA is responsible to both the party and Elections Canada, each association has its own executive and its own bylaws. The tensions that exist here between party and local chapter and the degree of autonomy and democracy at the local level are some of the key issues we will explore tonight. We have way too many examples of socialist candidates and activists getting stymied by the ostensibly progressive party they engage with. Two obvious examples being Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. Here in Canada, I'm sure all of us can name one, if not several, socialist candidates who lost their nomination in the NDP to a more centrist candidate who goes on to get out-liberaled by the Liberals. This core function of nomination of candidates is one of the main reasons we are taking a close look at the riding association. We also believe that a critical examination of the organizational role that EDAs play both within and without the broader party structure can provide us with insights that not only help socialists mobilize at the local level, but help ensure that we provide the electorate with a socialist choice at the ballot box. Here at Courage, Ottawa, we originally planned on calling this webinar Taking Over a Riding Association. But as one of our panelists pointed out, this implies that the riding association is by default against a socialist movement and a barrier to pushing the NDP to the left. Instead, the theme is winning over a riding association because this more accurately represents some of the experiences of our panelists, and quite frankly, it is far more hopeful to the rest of us. I think most of us can agree that many aspects of the NDP and Canadian political structures certainly do require a taking over, but the connection that riding associations have to the grassroots of that particular section of party membership is something to be used and expanded upon rather than overrun. That said, I look forward to discussing with the panelists aspects of this winning over versus taking over question, because our answer to that question shapes the strategies that we employ. I mean, these are really massive questions. Are we aiming to educate centrists so that they too become champions of socialism? Or is that a losing battle and we should instead aim to bring in more socialists into a political party to make it a simple numbers game and vote in the socialist policies we so desperately need? Do we need a combination of both strategies? Or is it even possible to negotiate the chasm that exists between the growing socialist consciousness that we see around us and party leadership that seems more preoccupied with PR than the working class and the urgent issues that we face, such as racism and climate change? Our panelists are 3 socialists, activists, organizers, and former NDP candidates. Please allow me to introduce them to you in their own words. Jessa McLean is a community organizer in Georgina, Ontario, who has worked with Fight for 15 and Fairness, Amnesty International, and of course, the NDP. As an outspoken socialist in a conservative stronghold, Jessa enjoys a good challenge. She is the president of York-Simcoe's federal and provincial EDAs and has run twice as a federal candidate. One of her main goals politically is to reshape the NDP into the working class party it was always meant to be. Diana Yoon is passionate about livable, prosperous communities. In her work, she helps accelerate climate solutions across the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Diana has been a long-time climate activist, putting equity at the forefront of our transition to a low-carbon future. Diana was the federal NDP candidate for Spadina Fort York in the 2020 election, working to bridge grassroots activism and electoral politics. She now organizes with local community residents in Chinatown to advocate for affordable housing and prevent displacement. And thirdly, Miles Krauter is a political organizer, movement activist, recovering academic, and bourbon quaffing karaoke enthusiast. A democratic socialist who cut his teeth organizing with the labor movement and the NDP. He left behind his PhD work on alienation to work in Ottawa City Councillor Menard's office after co-managing his election campaign. Miles has been involved in several different NDP EDAs over the past decade and was a provincial candidate for the NDP in 2014. He is also a founding member of Courage. We will begin tonight with a brief summary of each panelist's engagement with their riding association before we move on to some questions that I have prepared that will dive a little bit deeper into the challenges you have faced, your impressions about the politics of a riding association, its limitations, and how you view the NDP as a vehicle for socialist change. Following our discussion, we will have a short Q&A session with questions from our audience. And these questions can be submitted through the Zoom Q&A function or the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So to kick our discussion off, I would like to pose the same question to each of the 3 of you. So starting with Jessa. Why do you believe that the NDP can be a vessel for socialist politics? And more specifically, why and in what ways did you choose to engage with your EDA to achieve that goal?
I'll start by telling you how I got involved. We had a provincial election and I just noticed their social media was really lacking. So I reached out and they just took hold of me. They're like, yeah, whatever you want to do. I ended up managing the provincial campaign after a campaign manager left. And since then, I've just really taken hold of it, and I'm now the president of both of our ridings, because in some of these ridings, they're one and the same, even though we're technically different provincially and federally. It's that the resources are just so thin, we have to combine them. I engaged with my EDA because we had a really good candidate in the provincial election, and I felt like we could get a really progressive MPP out of it. Also because I just moved up here, and I desperately needed to find other progressives. I hadn't been involved with grassroots organizing up here yet, and in conservative stronghold, you start to believe that there are no other progressives. It becomes fearful to talk about socialism around your neighbors, and so I was really drawn to find out that, you know, that's one way I can get involved. I engage with, and it's not without its frustrations. We'll hear more about those as we go along tonight, but I continue to use the EDA to bring about socialism in Canada because it's one of the facets. It's one of the tools available to us, because we still do rely on electoral politics to a degree. And I think, like my riding association drew me in, if it's done properly and we're bold enough, these EDAs, these riding associations, can serve as a beacon to your fellow progressives, possibly revolutionaries that are out there that just don't know where to start. A lot of people are frustrated with the system. A lot of people want to do something. And it's not my only source of organizing. We all three of us here do a lot more work probably outside of our EDA than we do inside, but it's just one of those places that's easily recognizable and does have the structure behind it so that you can have some sort of organization to it. So yeah, until we smash the system completely, I think it's worthwhile to work within it as much as possible, to just provides various platforms as well.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Diana.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I'll also start with how I got involved. My family never really talked about politics. I immigrated to Mississauga when I was 4, and we'd lived there. My parents are working class, and yeah, I feel like there are a lot of things and a lot of like systemic barriers that we face, that a lot of our family and friends faced as well. But none of that was ever wrapped up in a discussion of why, and understanding, that even Mississauga is over majority people of color, and city council was like predominantly white or entirely white for the entirety of growing up. And I think for a long time I felt like, I don't know, like there wasn't really an NDP presence in Mississauga. It wasn't something I really was aware of. And so, when I was thinking about the issues that I cared most deeply about, I think as a young person, I think the threat of climate catastrophe has always really made me anxious, and thus motivated me to want to work on climate justice work. And so I was doing that. In university, I was doing fossil fuel divestment, anti-pipeline protests. And when I moved to Toronto, I was in a college program. I was like, if Toronto's going to be my home, let's start doing local politics. So I did a student internship with City Councillor McLean, who is kind of like NDP royalty, I guess, the legacy effect. And with that, a lot of folks were like, folks in this office and around were like, do you want to join the riding association? And I was like, I have no idea what a riding association is or what it does, but they're like, you can just be the youth rep. You don't have to do that much. Just like bring your ideas and energy. And I was like, that's fine. Eventually, I ended up being president, and then I think the year after I ran as the candidate. So my level of involvement has grown, but it's not been without its frustrations. It's not been, it has been a huge learning process of, what this political system is like, the barriers, the limitations, and also the constant struggle to make sure that we are bridging grassroots movements and social movements to this electoral process. And so that's really been what I feel like I've been learning over the last few years, and why I see it as a vehicle for societal change. I believe really truly that it did start as a Labour Party, and I want to, feel like that's the foundation of what we do. And I want to feel like there is, yeah, Emily, I really like what you said. We know that the electing politicians isn't it. The accountability is so important. And, I think there's a lot of ways that, we can make progress both within the system and outside of the system.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that NDP history thing is one of the more hopeful aspects of some of our discussion. I think that we'll have around what we can use the NDP for. And finally, Miles, the same question to you.
Yeah, so it's hey everybody. It's a tough question to answer. I mean, notwithstanding the neoliberal shift and sort of the often nebulous, uninspired progressivism or liberalism that has characterized the leadership of the party for far too long, I do think the NDP can be a vessel for socialist politics. It certainly has been historically, founded by working people, farmers, intellectuals, unlike the foundations of the other mainstream, the bourgeois parties. And even to this day, like I think it has a largely socialist membership. It still has socialist members of caucus at provincial and federal levels, as well as some socialist representation at the provincial and federal executives and council level. But putting the history aside, I mean, there's also the question of, why do we do this as political actors? Why engage the capital P political structures? And I think, the Marxian in me would say, you have to look at our strategies and evaluate them on whether they adequately confront existing centers of power, public centers of power in this case, because I don't think there's a shortcut sort of around society. You have to go through it. And it's like Jessa was saying, there's sort of that institutional advantage even of like being able to engage in the political sphere that people recognize as a political sphere. On Joel Hardin's campaign provincially, we had, I had also been organizing the 15 in Fairness, and then I went into that provincial campaign and I thought, Jesus, we had 1,300 volunteers. We talked to tens of thousands of people about redistributing wealth and asking them what they thought about it. And it was a very powerful tool to shift politics, really shift the ground beneath people's feet. So yeah, I mean, if I have to sully myself with partisan affiliations to do that work, to engage the state directly, as I think we must, so be it. It's requisite, I think. Parliamentary socialist strategy is requisite. It's not sufficient, though, right? And I appreciate courage insofar as it wants to have that conversation of how do we, break out of the world of capital P politics and link up with other strategic strategies of the left, right? And I think the party would do well to start figuring that out and stop behaving like a bourgeois party who just contests elections and start thinking about how to build community and class power.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of you for that answer. I was mentioning this before we got started, just how often on the left, when we get into critiques of the NDP in particular, or just the general state of late stage capitalism and how depressing it is, that it's can be a little hard to find hope. And I think that even with all of your critiques and touching on some of the limitations of that there are elements of things to be used and things to be expanded upon. So I'm really grateful that all of you highlighted that in your answer, because I think that's especially important for activists and organizers to keep in mind. I would now like to pose a few questions to all three of you and open it up for discussion amongst us. So the topic that we'll start off with is the relationship between NDP, particularly, Party Central, and the EDAs, especially as it pertains to party policy. I think it is pretty uncontroversial to point out how centrist the NDP headquarters is and how stifling this has been for the party membership, and especially for those on the left. I also encourage those of you who are working with the Green Party, I saw a couple of people chime in on the chat that I know this is going to be a really NDP specific discussion, but I'm sure that there's going to be lessons there to take to your own party headquarters, especially as you work towards electing a new leader. So, panelists, I would love to hear your thoughts about these tensions between headquarters and the EDA. Maybe if you can touch on what powers the EDA has in setting NDP policy, and have you had any successes using this power? Or have you had to essentially organize, as Jessa was touching on, organize as individuals and other issue-based movements, and then bring that into the NDP? So perhaps we'll start with Jessa, Miles, Diana, whoever's ready to go.
I'll briefly explain EDAs. Every time there is a convention, federal or provincial, EDAs submit resolutions that are supposed to shape policy, and we've got a really thick policy book, and that has all the policies that have ever been passed. And these resolutions are submitted to a council that's made up from the executive, and they prioritize those resolutions, because you can imagine many different resolutions of different wording get submitted. And so we only have a limited time on the floor at convention, because much of it is taken up by people speaking at us, not with us. So unfortunately, that's where it really stalls right now. There's a real need for a democratization of how the convention works, how those resolutions are prioritized, because even if, for example, there was a motion on Palestine and the BDS movement at the last provincial election here in Ontario, and despite, I think, 13 EDAs submitting the same resolution, it was prioritized absolutely last in its category. And even with immense efforts to try to reprioritize, there's all these procedures you can go through that very few people understand right now. We barely got it to the floor, and they ran us out of time after letting us into the room really late. It was really just a fiasco. So although EDAs technically hold power to shape policy, in our current reality, there's no movement on that. I'd like to provide hope that with a bit of democratization, but I believe that really will require not winning over, but taking over the executives who make all of these decisions. That being said, we still have to find ways to pull levers so that our leaders and our elected officials use that policy book and swear by it and fight for the things that we've clearly made our priorities. Right now, that's where we need to do a lot of work.
If I can chime in on the motions and stuff, I think it is really inaccessible. I know that oftentimes when you're choosing delegates to go to convention, there really isn't a detailed process of what a motion template is supposed to look like, or I think there's a lot of, you need to know other riding associations so multiple of you can sign on so that it gets higher on the priority list, things like that I feel like is just really institutionally set up that I think people do struggle with. And I think that's where a lot of like the prioritization that happens like dead in the morning and like people don't I feel like if it's your first time at convention, you don't know how early you're supposed to get there, or randomly you're shuffled into this room and people are yelling, and it's like but I think we talked a little bit about this before the webinar started, but even when a motion and a policy is made it into the platform, or made it into the policy book, it doesn't make its way into platform. What's that process, right? So I think there's just a lot of inaccessible elements to how we can shape national federal policy at the for the party.
I will give Courage a shout out, I guess, because the last federal convention, this is precisely what Jessa and Diana are talking about, has been a huge thorn in the side of people trying to move the party's politics, restore it, if you will. And so there was I'd co-authored a motion with another Courage member in Toronto and a couple of others to try to democratize the process at the last federal convention. We were able to get it passed, but it was like waking up at 5 a.m, standing in large lineups, trying to bustle to the mic, all these like weird, super undemocratic strategies of like mic muffins. And, it's a brutal process. The resolution was passed, and ostensibly the next convention could see a more democratized version that allows for online engagement to prioritize resolutions. But we'll see what actually comes of it. But it's super inaccessible financially too, right, is the other thing. We'd borrow money. My parents had to borrow money so my brother and I could go out to the 2015 convention, and we slept on the floor of like a flop house. It was, I really wanted to get Mulcair out of office, so there you go.
Yeah, I think you wouldn't be alone in sleeping wherever you could to do that. I do want to come back to something that Jessa and Diana in particular touched on, was the procedural rules as a potential barrier to getting involved and making changes happen at the convention. One of the things that I had sort of mulled about in my head, that do we need several socialist Robert's rules experts at our disposal to employ to navigate this? Like, is that something that you think we should invest time and energy trying to organize and educate around?
Well, I've got one in my pocket. He's in my EDA, and he's never far from us when we have to go to the mic. We just kind of plant him there, and he knows it back and forth. But again, that doesn't solve the issue of the prioritization process or getting policy to platform. I think I'll go back again saying EDAs can be very useful in organizing around the executive elections at convention and replacing the entire executive, so that not only are they socialist, ideally, but that they thrive on democratization, so that members are absolutely starved for policy discussion. Us lefties love to talk policies. We love to talk about issues, and we don't want to be talked at. So in order to change that whole process, I think it's got to come back to the executive positions.
In terms of, democratic engagement, something I've seen recently the party do well, surprisingly, is having some of these digital town halls. I think there's been like 1 or 2 from my local area, but Jagmeet is answering questions. That's like the entire point of what the town hall was. Or I think Matthew Green hosted the one I went to, and I think that's been, much more fruitful and engaging than what I've seen before. Even at convention, I think it's sometimes difficult to have, those questions asked directly to, the party and to the leader. And so I think that's been a surprisingly good part of like virtual engagement that I would like to see more of, and us do more regularly, and figure out how that can shape and actually, result in, outcomes.
Yeah, Miles, do you have anything to add on this procedural executive question? We may have frozen Miles accidentally.
No, I'm just very stoic and still.
Ah, okay, there we go.
Yes.
The statue speaks.
Yes. Did you ask me something? Sorry.
I did, yeah, sorry. I was just wondering if you wanted to chime in on sort of the procedural question, and kind of using, how do we infiltrate the executive? Do we need a Robert's Rules expert like the one that Jessa has to navigate some of the rules and regulations to eke socialism in that way?
Well, I mean, if the executive elections are very straightforward, right? You just have to have candidates and then organize people to vote for them. And EDAs are your portal to convention. The resolution prioritization thing is a mess, but it's not that complicated for executive elections. I mean, we almost got, through a last minute effort with Jessa at the last provincial convention, we almost got you on the executive, right? And that was planned very last minute. I remember, Jessa, we were cutting election flyers for you the night before the vote at midnight at a bar, right? And that, and the graphic design was done earlier that day on the convention floor, right? So that was a very last minute organized effort, and we almost won, right? So with a bit more effort, it's just tough to talk to people, I think, between EDAs, but and EDAs, I mean, this is, I think the thing to think about here when it relates to EDAs is how sort of how neglected they've been for so long by the party, right? As important institutions. That you read the description, Emily, at the top of the event of what an EDA is supposed to be, and I think it can be those things, but it's certainly been highly neglected. I think for the party, there's a lack of resources and training, and you know, I think part of that is just the culture of the NDP has changed. It's not through some authoritarian assertion of powers. It's really just a waning of democratic culture and a focus that has nothing to do with building community power anymore or organizing people. It's very comms professional driven, PR driven, you know, everything's got to have a focus group. We always have to talk about how to please fictional people that are like supposed to be these like, I guess, anthropomorphizations of our PR, of our, sorry, focus group studies. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you touched on a really important point that there is a definite sort of PR appeal to whoever that centrist voter is. Who is that person that exists in the political center and could vote any which way at any point?
Apparently her name's Gail and she's 30-something years old and likes dogs.
Yeah,
or whatever.
2.5 kids. Yeah. But that I wonder about how pervasive that is, not just within the NDP, but, you know, society at large. Like, it's not just the NDP that's doing that, it's other political parties. And I wonder if we have seen that in our own EDAs. And was that a culture that you have found that when you started to get engaged with your own EDAs, especially, this would be a question definitely to go to Miles for sure, who has experience in this, I think, especially, that there is a different kind of culture, the one that Diana was mentioning, and just a little bit less connected to the organizing and grassroots history of the NDP, that you as socialist would have had to enter in and change. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that kind of culture shift at the EDA level.
Sure. I mean, in ridings like Ottawa Centre, I think there's a bit more of a divide than you might find in other places that have been involved in other ridings where, you know, everybody's sort of on the same page and just wants to grow the strength of the party and pursue the horizon that the party is ostensibly established to pursue, right? But yeah, I mean, I want to push back against the like sort of takeover language because I don't think it's really taking over so much as taking back. These are institutions, all the old left institutions, unions, labor parties. They're ours, right? They belong to us, and they may have a leadership for a long time now that's sort of disconnected from that tradition and those origins, but they are ours, so we can take them back. But we also have to recognize that there's elders there, there's all sorts of good people there, there's people like me there currently, and Jessa and Diana there currently, that don't, you know, want to be taken over. We want to be, you know, those folks want to be won over, right? And that's a lot of and it's a hard work. But you can do it. You can earn the respect of elders in the riding that have worked for decades. The party may have left them behind politically years ago. But yeah, so I mean, these are our institutions, and it's you just have to have honest conversations, persuasive political approaches, and you have to go with humility into these spaces. And you know, if you think you're right about what politics we ought to be pursuing at the time, then have that conversation. I think, you know, it's and out-organize people. You know, the numbers game piece, I mean, that's important too. Really engage people that the party relies on to vote for them and get them involved, grow it.
I think that's an interesting point, Miles, like, you know, growing the base of our membership and of our party and of our local riding associations. You know, I think it has to come from a place where we are putting forward exciting socialist policies and talking about, like wealth taxes and nationalizing the GM plant and a lot of things that, we've seen, especially now during this pandemic, feel like are more possible than ever before. But, I think that's, yeah, I do, struggle with this a little bit where, I think that, yes, there has to be kind of new energy into a movement. But I also think, Jessa, you said, we're spending lots of our time and energy doing the work outside of these writing associations too. And so, how can we, I think I said this at my last executive meeting, but, how can we better do complementary work? So, I saw Toronto Centre did a training on how to unionize your workplace. And why don't we have that always, all the time from Central? I think that that's the kind of links between labor and the NDP that I would like to see strengthened, especially as so much of the labor unions, the big ones, I feel like are have quite liberal leadership now. So I think those are the questions that I have of how can we both grow our base but also strengthen the work we're doing collectively.
I think Miles touched on it when we were talking earlier about this electoral cycle that we get stuck in, and a lot of the organizing and resources that we get as EDAs from Central are focused on tools that you'll typically use during an electoral campaign as opposed to an issue-based campaign. So up here we try to grow our base by organizing or participating in other grassroots movements without branding them as NDP events. As a candidate, I guess I have a visibility, so they know that some of the participants are from the NDP, and you do get to talk to people one-on-one that are obviously like-minded, right? They're fighting for 15 in fairness, or we recently had an event for Black Lives Matter, and so you're within the circle of progressives that you need to be, and if they know that that's an option for them, it's more likely to happen. But Diana's right, we don't get enough from Central that focuses on organizing your workplace and things that really speak to what people need, as opposed to training on the different platforms that frustrate us during campaign times or how to fundraise. That's important, but it doesn't really spark much enthusiasm out of especially new members. I mean, and I'm reading the chat here and there, and James asked people, are you involved with your EDA? And although they were interested enough to come on here and hear about EDAs, I'm seeing a lot of them have not yet stepped into that foray or have been frustrated by and stepped back. So I encourage everyone that's on here to re-engage with your EDA. You don't have to take on a huge role, but attend a meeting. And I think you'll be surprised. These folks are struggling to do some really good work and need bodies, need enthusiasm, need skill sets from grassroots organizers to throw these kind of events that we're seeing. And Etobicoke Lakeshore is a great example. Tim Ellis does some really great work down there. And there's other riding associations that can be really shining examples, and we can pool our resources and teach each other as EDAs, share resources, share town halls and whatnot. But that's not something we have to wait from Central to actually do. We can do that amongst ourselves if we have the bodies behind it.
I think being organized, there's a lot of, I think it's, my EDA didn't have a website. It was very hard to find out who to contact, so I kind of came in through someone on the Writing Association already. It now has a website, and I think our team has put in a lot of work to try to think about how do we, grow our membership and want to have a bit of a public profile. But I think it is interesting. I think how can we better learn from each other, and where there are really good things. I know Tim Ellis I've talked to about how they do condo organizing, and I can learn from that too here in Spadina Fort York for sure.
Totally. I want to get to one more question on this topic before we switch to the next section. And this one actually is a better question than the one I had written. It's from Sam, who chimed in on Facebook with this one. And this one is outside of the policy platform focus, like what else can EDAs do to fight for and achieve the kind of things that we're talking about right now? Some of these other measures, like hosting training sessions, engaging a little bit more closely with grassroots organizations, or democratizing the NDP party process as a whole. Is there a role that EDAs can play there?
You know, I've been dreaming for a long time that, you know, my EDA or EDAs in general can start to, I guess, prefigure or mimic what the German SDP used to do when it was still a mass party, the German Social Democratic Party. But I am reminded that the German SPD, when it was doing all this amazing community work, it was actually banned from running in elections, so it wasn't getting caught in that electoral cycle, right? But they had choirs, they had book clubs, kids camps, and to a certain extent, you still see these things in some of the old social democratic parties today. But there's a whole bunch of work, and EDAs are free to do that work. I mean, you can raise your own money and then basically spend it how you see fit. You can even just contribute to other organizations that are doing good work, and we've done that in the past. But the tricky part is, you know, how do you find the time and not get too burnt out from the election cycle to actually do this work for, let's face it, a party that it's sometimes hard to feel inspired to do work for, and you're not being reflected, your political aspirations aren't being adequately reflected at the leadership level. So it is a tough thing to pull off, but there's certainly, I mean, the sky's the limit, I think. The EDAs could do all sorts of work it's not currently doing, or they're often not currently doing. Toronto Centre accepted. I saw that event. What an amazing event to host.
Diana or Jessa, do either of you want to jump in on this before we move on to the next section?
Yeah, I mean, really quickly, I think there's a lot that we can be doing to push, you know, shift the Overton window, you know, the realm of what's possible in the political sphere. I think that's really at the core, like the organizing that we should be doing, you know. I know there are days of action, but how can we make them more substantial? How can we really, really connect with, you know, local groups, community groups, neighborhood groups, or if there is like a specific issue-based group, you know, I've had my riding association go to TTC Riders, a transit advocacy group, some of their transit stop flyering, kind of like talking to canvassing. That's the word. I'm like, why is this word not coming to my head? I canvassed for 8 hours a day for like 6 months last year. But yeah, you know, I think that that's the kind of thing that doesn't really feel like we know how to do well. You know, I think that that's the kind of thing where it's like, how do you, you know, Jessa's, you're saying, you know, how do you go to some of these events that you don't have to fly the NDP flag? It's about building genuine relationships and, you know, working to feel like people working on justice, on social justice issues, on transit, on affordable housing. You know, this is the work that we're supposed to be doing as the left party. So how can we like more deeply engage with that? And I think some of it is, yeah, you know, internal education. I think that there's lots that can be done on that front, but I think that work comes with, you know, bringing in the experts and the leaders, the community leaders who are doing this work, who are, you know, bringing us to like marches and protests and, you know, being bodies and not having an NDP banner. I don't need an NDP sign that says Green New Deal if I'm at a climate march. I don't like, so a lot of things like that. But yeah, it's things I think about a lot where, you know, what's the work we can be doing most authentically and genuinely.
Yeah. Jessa, do you have anything to say on roles EDA can play here?
Well, I think we'll touch on it later or as we progress, but through your candidates, elections provide a unique platform where people are actually captivated by politics. A lot of people tune out in between. So we're not talking about the people who are already involved in activism and connecting with them, because that's important. But Miles and Diana have already spoken to that. But we're talking about the people who have completely checked out because they hear the same things over and again. So if an EDA is organized and does a really thorough search and finds a great socialist candidate, and organizes around them come nomination meeting, then they have the entire campaign to help shift that window, to speak to people, to inspire people, to get that Bernie Sanders AOC effect where this is something different. And the EDA needs to be supportive of them. That's crucial. That doesn't always happen, but they are in charge of choosing that candidate, or should be in charge of choosing that candidate. So that's just another tool available to them.
Absolutely, and thank you for that incredibly perfect segue into the next section about candidates. This is often the topic that can attract the most attention. Sometimes it's recently it's being framed as who is going to be, you know, Canada's AOC or some variant on that question. And we all know that there's so much more to socialist organizing than having a great socialist candidate running for election. But as we have all touched on, you can't deny the importance of having boldly left-wing candidates to vote for and help shift that Overton window as we were talking about. We know Miles worked to get Joel Harden nominated here in Ottawa Centre, went on to win the provincial seat here in Ottawa Centre, and both Jessa and Diana have been recent socialist candidates for the NDP in their ridings. So I would like to just toss this question to all three of you. How do we get a socialist candidate nominated?
Well, I think we're going to find that that answer will vary based on where you are. So in what Central likes to call unwinnable ridings, we talked about that term, it's cringeworthy, but you have a lot of freedom in electing your candidate. They generally are desperate for somebody to put themselves out there. It's a very vulnerable position to put yourself into, especially when you're in a conservative stronghold. So you can put the most, I'm pretty sure my riding put the most socialist person in my riding out there. I've yet to meet anybody farther left than me up here. And so there was no pushback because I was the only person who'd really take that kind of role. And we were adamant that we needed a socialist candidate. So that was that. But we see down in the core where they're hotly contested, Toronto's core, sorry, I'm very Toronto centric, that there was a lot of controversy. There were socialist candidates that maybe thought they had the numbers. You know, I can't speak from firsthand knowledge on how it went down, but we know there was a lot of kerfuffle around them, and Central pays a lot more attention and has anointed their own candidates for these particular ridings. So that would be a lot more difficult challenge. That requires a lot more organizing. That's a numbers game, getting people registered. So that person has to be inspiring and have many, many connections and have a lot of support of the riding around them. It can't just be an outlier. So it will vary based on your riding association, but within your riding, whoever that candidate is, even if it is a riding like mine where it seems completely unwinnable, every election, if you have someone inspiring, you gain more and more people into your riding association. You start to shift that window yourself within your own demographic, within your own geographic space there. So it does play a role in bringing socialist ideas to your neighbors, which is a great place to start.
Miles, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I agree with what a lot of what Jeff was just saying. I think, you know, and I want to frame this as like, how does this involve the EDA? I think for sure one of the reasons that we ended up getting Joel Harden as a candidate was that several folks on the left in town that had been involved in spaces outside the NDP were all of a sudden EDA members. I was actually president at the time as well, and I think it means a lot for if you are involved in an EDA, you can reach out to, when you're doing candidate search, you can recognize the leadership of all these socialists in your community, these activists, these community builders. They'll get a call from the NDP, which is you, right, located on your EDA, saying, hey, we recognize how great you are. You've been doing all this great stuff with workers' rights or whatever it is, right? And we think you would be a great candidate. And I think that means a lot. And if you're also people who are, I think a lot of us are doing this great work outside the party already, going into the party and still trying to do that work, you earn people's respect, right? And it's a tough situation to navigate. And the other piece of it, in Joel's case especially, was, came to it with, well, Joel's campaign, he came to it with humility. He really built a coalition of, I think, elders in the party, people who had been around for a long time and were kind of getting tired of being treated like ATMs by the party, and a lot of young people and new people that had felt disenchanted with the NDP or never felt comfortable getting involved. But then through our campaign, we were able to sort of bring all these people in and at the same time win over longstanding members of the party. And it was that combination of factors, I think, that won it for us. It's difficult. I mean, we were up against essentially the establishment, right? There was definitely a wee bit of skullduggery, but very minor. And at the end of the day, we didn't get disqualified. Joel was vetted despite his radical views. And so there is democracy. It's imperfect in the party, but it's there. I mean, Joel had run just before that trying to win the leadership of the local labor council and lost because of how corrupt it is. The NDP, on the other hand, was actually a much more democratic space to organize within. So there you have it.
I think for me, I was on the Riding Association, and it's funny because I was just about to launch our candidate search, and two kind of really good timing things happened, I guess, or just like things that really took me by surprise. But Suze Morrison, an MPP for Toronto Centre, actually reached out to me and said, "Tina, do you want to have coffee? I want to talk to you about politics." And I was like, what on earth is happening? And she was like, "I know you don't have ties to Toronto Centre, but have you ever considered running maybe this year?" And I was like, no. Maybe in like 10-20 years, I don't know, I'm like 24, but I guess I was 23 at the time. But yeah, I really was like, but I think coming from her, it felt really real. She's fairly young, she's Indigenous, she's a renter. I was like, oh, you just won last year. And I know it was, contested for her, but, and I think that's what we talked a little bit about, where, I didn't know if there were going to be other folks. I thought it was going to be contested, but it ended up not being so. So, that was kind of a big step in how that came out to be for me. So being asked by, the people who do have the resources and who are thinking about this all the time and how we grow, real like leftist socialists in this party. I don't, I think the other thing is I went to Power Shift, Youth Climate Justice Conference in Ottawa in, I think, February last year. And, in the fall, I'd been following Paige Gorsak's campaign. She ran in a nomination campaign in Edmonton, which is, wild, anti-tar sands, like major climate justice activist running in Edmonton. And that was super, super cool at Power Shift that Paige and her team, Emma Jackson from 350, a lot of folks that, I've known for a long time through divestment and anti-pipeline work, but they were like, it sucked. It was so hard, but we organized so hard. And she lost by just a handful of votes, but that's and lost to, I think, the preferred candidate out of the outgoing MP, I'm not sure, but yeah, MP. But I think that was also really like, they ran a workshop at Power Shift to a room of folks who probably in many ways feel really like alienated and disengaged with the like capital P politics electoral system. And so, I think that's something that was also really, really cool to like learn from them. They had guides set up. They had like, this whole workshop of like why we should care and why we, why it felt like they were growing skills and like growing as a team. And even though they lost, it was really, really worthwhile for them. So I think a lot of things like that really, and just the constant amount of door knocking and what that really gave value to even growing their climate justice Edmonton base. So yeah, really big kudos to them. I love them very much.
Yeah, thanks for that answer, everyone. That is also really nice and hopeful that there is democracy there with that hard work of organizing at the local level. I think that that level of possibility to override the establishment forces, at least at your own local level, is the fact that that's a possibility is fantastic. But Julia asked us in the chat, and it's very similar to another question that I have for you, which is once that socialist candidate is nominated, what then is the relationship between that candidate and HQ? What kind of censorship is there? What kind of dismissal, funds? And potentially, how can you overcome that? Or do you have any tools or strategies that you can share with us? Or is it just like a losing battle?
Okay. So in the by-election, there was 2 by-elections happening at the time, myself and Jagmeet Singh. So thankfully, a lot of the attention was not on my campaign. However, when I spoke against the coup happening in Venezuela and the Canadian government's support of that coup, I received a phone call, an angry phone call, telling me to stop talking about Venezuela when the entire country was talking about Venezuela. So not talking about it wasn't an option. And I was actually on my way to my very first televised debate. And, you know, I've suffered from chronic anxiety. So I was not in the mood for a call like this. And I absolutely pushed back verbally. It was not pretty. And that's the way I left it. I was just adamant I was not going to be silenced. But it made me very, very nervous. And I was explaining to my comrades here yesterday that it did cause me pause. So when I am to speak on an issue, I do in the back of my head go, are they going to sign my nomination papers again if I want to run? Will I be blacklisted? And I think the only thing that really saved me was that the membership was so clear online and in letter writing and phone calls how we felt on that Venezuela issue, that we demanded our leadership take a clear stand, and collectively we pushed them, right? So we heard from Sven and Nikki and a few others, and then all membership seemed to be close to unanimous on the issue. So I think when you have a socialist candidate up there, or we have socialist MPs and MPPs, we need to have their backs in that way. We can't just like their comments. We need to let Central know that they have a following, that they have the support, that that is where we are ideologically, and they better get with the program or we're going to withhold our donations. That's been an effective campaign we've had in the past where, you know, you sign on to this Green New Deal or we're not, like, don't even call me. Do not email me one more time unless you start to take a more progressive stand on X, or you got to give them a very clear path to take. So yeah, having a socialist candidate up there isn't the be all end all, because there is attempts to push back on us. And I'll share just another brief anecdote. Even within my circle, my very, very supportive circle, when writing my speeches, I use very socialist language. I'm an anti-capitalist. I don't hide the fact. I used, even the term working class was cringed upon within my small circle. You know, stop calling people comrades, other bits of advice that I was getting to make me more palatable to the conservative audience that I was likely to face. But I refused nicely, because these are my family, my NDP family. But I found that the most people that came up to me or commented it or emailed us were drawn to that new type of language. And often the excuse given is people aren't ready for this, right? People don't know what term working class means. They think it means just blue collar folks. It's kind of can be seen as a lesser than. And I said, well, if we don't use that term and explain that term, then they'll never truly understand that they are all working class people. So I'm not speaking to the 1%. They are all, so it's our job as socialist candidates to push beyond and teach the communities around us exactly what socialism is. And campaigns can offer a unique time to do that.
Yeah. Miles or Diana?
Yeah, a few ways. I guess I've experienced some tensions between Central and the campaign. You know, I think that, sorry, also this like glaring sun, this, I can't fix it. I don't know where else to go in my 1-bedroom condo. But yeah, I felt like I didn't get a ton of pushback for the things. It's funny, this kind of winnable, unwinnable, like, I came second, 12,000 votes. I feel like, if Toronto's swung entirely, it definitely could have gone entirely orange. So, but yeah, I felt like I had a lot of flexibility to like talk about a wealth tax, especially like day to day, like at the door, talk to folks regularly about the things that they needed that they weren't getting. I'd say I was talking about free transit on some digital communications, and the party was like, that's not, why are you talking about that? It's not an all-party platform. I'm like, it is like absolutely in our, our environmental section of this platform. Here is the page. Like, that was baffling. And yeah, I was contacted by a journalist to talk about, diversity and racism, and I think a lot of like the Jagmeet getting a lot of racism in the campaign, and I had like a whole prep call where they kind of were like, but we're doing well right now, like we don't really want to talk about like race specific issues, like our platform is for like all people. And I was like, it's literally missing the point so much. That's campaign specific. I've been on events and I've had a local elected official I've gotten into quite an argument about how he felt like I shouldn't be talking about capitalism so much because that was alienating for folks. And I was like, I literally do not understand what we are like. How can I not talk about capitalism? It's like the root cause of, so much of what, we say we care about. But, so I think there's things like that where, that's not central per se, but I think it reflects the values and mindsets. And I think, Miles, you said this, it's like there are lots of socialists in the party. I think that's true. I think that there are also lots of liberals in the party, and I don't, that's something I grapple with. And I think that's something, we are very cautious as a party. I think we need to be bolder and more courageous in wanting to, really, like, that is the way we inspire and energize the base. That's what, the conservatives do that all the time. Why don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to toss this to Miles. I just want to add in just a little technical question for Miles too. Just how possible is it for HQ to squash the nomination of a candidate once they've been nominated by their EDA?
So once they're already nominated to withdraw their candidacy?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's easier for them to get rid of the problem, and ideally, if they're like the problem, to just not let a socialist get the nomination in the first place. So there's various tactics they use then, like taking a really long time to vet somebody. There's sort of the preferred candidate who's vetted in a day, and then the sort of cantankerous left-wing person who takes 3 months to vet. Strategies like that certainly. Organizing staffers, okay, like Paige Gorsak's campaign, that was clearly an element, was staffers from the ABNDP. Once you're the candidate, though, you have quite a bit of leverage, especially if you are in a so-called winnable riding. The party doesn't want to jettison a candidate mid-election for various reasons. One, I mean, it just basically costs them that riding. And if they're hoping to win it, they're not going to want to do that. But two, it also creates a story potentially in the media that they don't necessarily want to deal with either. And there's all sorts of reasons. So once you're the candidate, you actually have a lot more leverage to say what you want. I mean, people call you and yell at you. When I was a candidate, I was called and yelled at because I said into some newspaper that, this is back when I was in the GTA, that I thought, they asked me one thing a local issue that I personally would like to see advanced as opposed to party policy or whatever was in the platform that time around. And I said, I'd like to see the 407, the tolled highway, the tolls come to an end and have it put back in public hands. It's a privatized road, right? And somebody yelled at me about that, for example. But there was nothing. They don't want to get rid of you. They still need you. They'll take your sacrifice, like what Jessa, you were speaking earlier. I made me think of this. It's like they'll take your sacrifice. They just won't necessarily help you win. But they need your name on a ballot. They need somebody on a ballot.
Are there any strategies that we can use to counter that dragging their feet on vetting as one possible sort of interference play? What kind of things can we do within the EDA or without to ensure that a socialist candidate gets that nomination?
Fortunately, I think a lot of the vetting is just really behind closed doors, so to say. So once your writing association puts forth a candidate, or even before the nomination meeting, everyone needs to be vetted in order to stand for nomination. And in my experience, even though, like I said, there were only 2 by-elections happening at the time, my vetting took about 2.5 months. The questionnaire is filled with really open-ended questions. One of them is, have you ever been involved in anything controversial? Well, I mean,
I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so indeed.
well, you don't know what to include there. Your social media is gone through heavily. We had a group of Ontario candidates that a line of communication open to all Ontario candidates in the last election, and we were hearing horror stories of vetting, of people being asked to take down photos that showed too much cleavage. People with mental health issues were or told they couldn't run just yet until there's enough time between them and their crisis points. And I mean, you can appeal. If you are rejected as a candidate, there is an appeal process. You are given a reason, and there's a certain amount of days you can appeal. I've never had to do that. And I don't know anybody who's done that and been successful or not, but I don't think there's much role the EDA can play, but other than perhaps get creative and you could refuse to stand behind another candidate, which would make it very difficult for them to parachute somebody in. But along official channels, no, there's really not much. You put up a list and that's it.
Okay.
I think there's also, it's really hard to know like when a nomination meeting is if you're not already like actively involved in a writing association usually. So, I think it is a little bit of like the long game, it's if the candidate search, like if there's not an apparent ready candidate, which for most writings, there shouldn't be. And even if there is, I think it's very real to, know that things change and there are lots of new folks who might want to contest that, and I think that's kind of where, I think, I think it really, really does reflect like who is on that candidate search committee, what's the diversity of the EDA, what are the, qualities that they're looking for. Jessa, like you saying, you absolutely wanted a socialist candidate. I have never heard any writing association ever say that. That's never been like criteria 1 in a candidate search that I've ever heard of. So, I think that's, I'm really glad we're having this conversation.
Yeah.
Well, I was chairing those meetings, so maybe that was just me talking, because if it was between a centrist or a liberal going up, I would just have put myself up there, and in the end did, but uncontested. So I can't say whether it was unanimous or not, but I was adamant.
Mm-hmm. I think that this is a really good time to hop into our final topic of discussion, which I've casually named reimagining the EDA. So this is going to touch on quite a few topics that we've already mentioned so far, ways that we can make the EDA better. And I would love to hear your thoughts more generally about if and how we can use the EDA towards a socialist reclaiming of the NDP at large, as well as how we can we transform the EDA into a better structure that is more easily used to advance socialist politics and consciousness at the community level. So I know we've talked about a few tactics so far. expanding the diversity of who's on the EDA executive. Even a little something that Diana mentioned was just how difficult it was to find information about the EDA. I found that Samara Institute, I believe what it is, they do lots of research in terms of into Canadian democracy and political structures. They did a study about 5 years ago or so showed that remarkably few riding associations of all major parties across the country have any real information that is usable, that is easily accessible. The NDP scored pretty well on this, but still I think there's a lot more gains and a lot more things that we should do to push our EDAs to be much more accessible to everyone who wants to get involved. So yeah, there's tactics like that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can transform the EDA and maybe how we can also transform the NDP through that structure. Miles, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I kind of touched on it in an earlier question, so forgive me for that. In my meandering fantasizing about the German SPD and all the sort of community building they were doing. What I loved about it so much was that about the idea of it at least, is that it's not inherently political stuff, right? You can actually do just communal things, but at the same time, you're actually pulling people into a political space that they might not have otherwise entered, right? If you're part of the social democratic choir, for example, maybe you just wanted to sing, but now all of a sudden the church hymn lyrics have been replaced with radical socialist lyrics or what have you, right? And so I'm fascinated by that sort of just general community building activity. But then there's also, the broader organizing work, issue-based campaigning, solidarity work you can do. I mean, why doesn't every riding association have a flying squad to show up on picket lines anytime somebody's local is on strike? Why aren't we, organizing fundraisers for somebody else that's not us for once, recognizing somebody who's doing great work? We actually did this on Joel Hardin's nomination campaign. Our second fundraiser was for overdose prevention in Ottawa, in recognition of the great work they were doing. But I think, a lot of this work could easily transform the EDA, and there's nothing stopping people from doing it. And EDAs are basically just ready for you to show up and start doing what you want with them for the most part. And they do actually lead to transforming the party potentially, because they are your portal to convention. They are your portal to changing the executive of the party. They are your portal to getting a candidate, earning the respect of leaders in the community and getting that candidate you want. And ultimately, they're your infrastructure for winning the elections and getting socialists elected, right? And those candidates that you get elected could be the seeds of a future, socialist leadership of the party. So there's all sorts of, that it is the place to start. It's the local level.
I think, for me, I do think a lot about the time and energy I've put into this party and to my riding association. And I think a big takeaway has always been, I think that it's so fundamentally important to be connected to a political home that is not just the party and not just the riding association. I think that, being really, really engaged in a local kind of organizing entity, an activist group, a socialist group, climate justice, or, even your neighborhood associations, something that shows that you're more connected to the grassroots and to people than what I think a very top-down approach to EDAs often is, where there's, without a lot of imagination, there's not a lot to do outside of the nomination process, or the few things that Central asks you to the paperwork to fill out. I think there is a lot of space to feel like you have an active and engaged group of people, and you have hopefully a membership base that at least an email list or a phone list. And I think there's so much potential there to be doing the work that Miles talked about, and I think to really form genuine connections in our community, to community build, to not really even be about the party or your local riding association, but, you know, to do social justice work, to like, you know, have this kind of sense of community of socialists who care deeply about each other and about hopefully, you know, reshaping the political structure at large. I think, you know, AOC's documentary with a bunch of other folks, like Knock Down the House, they said like hundreds of us have to try for one of us to get in. I feel that way a lot in like Canadian politics as well. You know, I think that even the few socialist MPs have really made a difference. You know, Matthew Green having Sandy Hudson and Desmond Cole on his like webinars, really, really impactful, reaching an audience that I think needs it. I think the NDP needs to hear it, you know? And so that's the kind of thing where, you know, EDAs should be encouraging that work out of their local elected officials, or doing that work, organizing, you know, those events themselves if they can, you know, and they don't have to be expensive. I think it's like trying to figure out what you can pull together with what you have.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Jessa, I just want to toss in another element to perhaps discuss. I know this is something that you were chatting about before we got started, was how to break out of that electoral cycle focus that EDAs often have. And maybe you could speak a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, it's tough because, I mean, your fundraising is a lot easier to do when people understand what the necessity is, that there's a campaign and they are expensive. But like Diana says, a lot of the work can be done at very low resources. So keeping active in between elections is crucial to building your base within your riding. One thing that our riding association does, and it was created by one of our old timers who's really held the riding together, is a 1-800 number that costs almost nothing a year. I think it's really paltry. I don't know what it is, but if we can afford it, it's not very much at all. And it links to our cell phones. So it, you know, we rotate who's responsible, but that way, every time you do a Google search and you're looking for a riding association, there's always a way to get in touch with us that is responsive, as opposed to, you know, the 5th email address to check. Nobody's really motivated to stay on top of some things like that. So we try to remain accessible to our folks. And I mean, as far as transforming the EDA outside of campaigns, you can really make it what you want it to be. Yes, there's some forms to fill out, and we do have to have a certain executive, or technically can be taken over, which is really just a technicality. But it doesn't have to be elections focused. You can do issue-based campaigns with or without the flag. I think we're more accessible without. But holding open meetings, not just membership meetings, but completely open meetings to your community so that they can see exactly what the work of an EDA is. A lot of people are afraid to step into that foray, maybe think it's inaccessible, it's already an established clique. But you'll find that the more open and transparent that you are, and the more times you are available to the people in your community, the more likely you'll get some of those great folks that really come on and help you transform what your own EDA looks like. In terms of reshaping the party, like Miles said, that EDA is the only access you get really as delegates. Choosing the right delegates and organizing with other EDAs across the province or across the nation ahead of time. So Central now does do regional calls to EDA presidents or other executives if the president can't make it. So you're learning and coming into contact with other EDAs this way. So organizing with them outside of those official channels to get an executive elected, to organize resolutions, to come up with ideas to democratize the situation, to share resources, that's crucial. And in terms of shaping party politics, that's really the only access you're going to have. So I encourage people, again, to join your EDA, or at least see what they're about. If you can't reach them through the email you find online, find the candidates, Twitter, shout at them there. They'll know who to get in touch with, because often I've heard so many horror stories of people trying, I can't get in touch with them, nobody answers my emails. And just know sometimes it's one person. Like, there are times where I feel like I'm the only person, and I'm sure there's other members of my riding where I fall back. I mean, I just had a baby, so I haven't been all that active, where they're the only person responsible for everything. Fundraising, answering the emails, coming up with new ideas, setting meeting minutes. Like, they need help really badly. So just don't expect the work to get done around you, and don't be disheartened when, you know, it's crickets when you reach out to some random email address, especially if it's linked to Central. They don't do a very good job with letting us know the tools that they've provided with us. We do have writing websites apparently, but I've never had any input on them, and I'm a writing president. So go through other official channels, you know, like I said, like the candidate on Twitter. And it's not unique to the NDP. I know here, even it's a conservative stronghold, but our Liberal counterparts have been decimated. They have no writing association. Their president resigned because we won't get into that, but they're a blip. And we always thought we were the third-rate underdogs. And when we found this out and we really looked into it, you know, sometimes your competition isn't as stiff as we think it is. They're not as well, you know, even though they've got a lot more donations and a lot more organization, they're just as bad and in these unwinnable ridings, quote unquote. So there's really hope when you hear that, because if we can get ourselves organized better than, you know, your opponents, and continually do that in between elections, you really help shape your constituents, rather than just waiting for those very few weeks before election time.
Yeah, briefly, we're going to wrap up this section of the discussion after this last question to you, before we move to the questions from our audience members, which has been such a busy chat. So thank you in advance to the audience for that. But one of the final kind of question I have for all of you would be, ultimately, what kind of advice would you give to someone who is wanting to jump into an EDA and start helping to organize their own EDA, possibly make some bigger changes at the NDP? And feel free to toss any final remarks that you want to make about that or any of the other topics we've discussed. So I will start with Diana.
I think that it's, you know, I have felt like, you know, maybe I should have been more proactive in reaching out to other riding associations earlier on. You know, I think there's a lot of, you know, I think it is hard to feel like, yeah, there aren't too many people who are doing all of the work. There's not very much guidance. We didn't have a organizer from the party for a while. And I think there, you know, that's good and bad. I guess it gives you more flexibility in some ways. But, you know, I think I think, you know, the riding associations that are finding things that are working for them to like do this community building, I think there needs to be better ways that we can do knowledge transfer. And so, you know, I think that's something I'm thinking about, where, you know, what role can Courage do to like facilitate some of that? Or, you know, I think that's what I have found is like, it's been easiest to connect with other folks in riding associations at Courage Toronto meetings. But yeah, I don't know. I think the advice is that I find it frustrating all the time. But I think that at this current point, I don't believe in starting a new political party. I don't believe in joining any other political party. So this is what I feel like, you know, for better or for worse, we're going to keep banging our heads against this wall and doing less of it when I need to, you know, doing more work that is joyful and fulfilling and fruitful in my community, and, you know, fighting gentrification and fighting terrible developments in Chinatown and things like that, you know. But that's the kind of work that I think, you know, there's skills I think you can grow definitely as someone in your EDA, but I think there's lots of skills that you can grow outside of it too.
Perfect, thank you. I'll toss this to Miles next.
I mean, get involved, but come to it with humility, and definitely don't, if you're coming from the left and outside the party, be careful not to conflate sort of what you see of the party, namely sort of party central and the leadership of the party, conflate that with the people, the membership, right? The rank and file. Just in the same way you wouldn't look at Jerry Diaz as the leader of Unifor and be like, oh, I guess all Unifor workers are kind of have this uncomfortable nationalism and love the liberals, right? Like that, you wouldn't do that. And for the same reason, I mean, unionists don't often choose their local there as directly as people choose their parties, but definitely come to it. And I think you'll recognize that a lot of these folks, the NDP membership is great. I mean, I love the NDP membership. It's a lot of decent folks with often really good politics. Sometimes not so much. Diana's right. There's definitely some liberals. There's quite a few of them. There's a lot of folks who just who are socialists but don't know it yet. And I think you can really do something with that. Yeah.
And Jessa.
The advice I'd give is not to be daunted, and don't underestimate your skill sets. I originally signed on to my writing just to help with their Twitter account because it was a hole that obviously needed to be filled. And then I ended up being a candidate and the president. It's a quick learning curve. It may sound a lot of technicalities, but in order to thrive, you really don't have to, you just need one person that knows the bylaws or can access them. It's an immense amount of skill set and even just enthusiasm is enough to just keep a writing going. So don't think that you're not qualified enough. I studied political science. I was the president of a Amnesty chapter, and I still kind of stepped into it going, I felt uneasy, and I quickly realized that any help is welcomed help. And I just, a quick little story at the provincial convention, underestimating your own potential. It wasn't me that wanted to run for the executive. It was supporters that came to me after seeing me run as a candidate, and I guess they liked my politics or my brashness, I don't know, or both, but they lifted me up and encouraged me, and they did so much work around me within minutes. They were organized and telling me exactly how this was going to be possible. And I went from going, no way, I've heard you need to be anointed to get one of those positions, to like, let's do this. We are going to do this, or we're going to die trying kind of deal. And we came within 11 votes. And I'm telling you, it was really thrown together. But that's exactly the kind of passion we need and the support we have to give each other. So don't sit back and expect that work's going to be done in the writing. Don't complain about the party not being left enough if you're not in there trying to push them left yourself, because it's not going to get done without you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Just quickly, I do think that you don't have to be working within the party to shift it further left. I think that, societal shifts, like the, activism, the protests, the petitions, like all of that work, I think, we're party, so much of all of the political parties are so reliant on like polling data and how people feel. And like, I think that there's lots of good work that can be done outside of the party.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very important intervention. Thank you. So we're going to flip it to the questions that we've been receiving from the audience. So I'm just going to ask that the panelists keep your answers as brief as possible, just that we can get to as many questions as we can. We've got quite a few about international relations, which I will get to shortly. I'll try to maybe lump those together to make a little bit more of a cohesive discussion. But to start it off, I have a question here from Fred, which is, do you think the NDP, provincially or federally, struggling financially and in terms of elected seats as well, is the NDP a good opportunity for socialists to win over ridings and central executives? And this could also, that idea of, is the NDP the right party, goes into a few little bubbling ups of questions about the Green Party and what happens if the Greens elect socialists, and that kind of question. Is the NDP the right spot, essentially, for these actions, especially now given its financial state? So whoever wants to go for that one, jump on in.
Certainly vis-a-vis the Green Party, the NDP is actually a working class party. It was founded by working people and not a bunch of disenfranchised conservatives, for one. So, just historically and structurally, I think that's important to note. But the other thing I'll say is like, we can have another left party if you want, but the same problem is you're going to be faced with the same problems and barriers, the same potential calcification of these structures, or Pesocification, I guess I should say. I mean, certainly a lot of us had hopes for Syriza as a new left-wing formation in Greece. And they ended up in a social democratic trap as well, right? So, which isn't to say that it'll always fail, but it is to say that it's difficult. And the vehicle you choose, it's just like any democratic institution is subject to potential corruption and other people sort of steering it away from its original goals. So, I often talk about unions in that way, where I'm like, yeah, a lot of unions suck, but we still engage with them anyways because they're democratic structures established by working people that belong to us, and we should use them. But yeah, folks, if there's another party perhaps that's doing better work, and we can try that too. But I suspect we'll end up finding the same problems that we have to grapple with. We can't escape them through a nominal change.
I'm excited to see if, we get an eco-socialist green leader. I think that'd be great. I haven't been following it that closely, but, I think that is the direction I would like the NDP to go also, and have been trying quite hard to think about, what makes that possible. My first federal convention, I don't know what stage of Kinder Morgan pipeline fiasco we were in, Trans Mountain, but it was like the Alberta NDP were in the room, the BC NDP were in the room, and no one talked about Kinder Morgan at all. We were just like, okay, we're just going to ignore this entirely, and it was baffling to me as my first foray into this weird convention space. It's I think the year before I was arrested on Parliament Hill for protesting Kinder Morgan. I was we have major political, all of the NDP who care to be at convention, and we aren't, not a single motion I heard. So, there's things like that where I'm I recognize that there's lots and lots and lots of work that needs to be done to drive the NDP to an eco-socialist direction. So yeah, I think, if you want to do it at the Green Party and out-organize like hell to make it happen, then I'm intrigued. I do think on a riding level, I have not been to, I've been to a few different riding association AGMs, and barely ever contested executive positions. So, I think Jessa said, I'm pretty sure they're eager to have your help and your energy. And so, I don't think it's very intimidating. I don't think it's that. I mean, some of them might be if they're older and bigger, but lots of them need your involvement.
I would like to sort of blend a couple of questions that we've received. One was about can we define what the working class means? And I think that that's something that the NDP obviously really needs to do. And I'm not asking us to come up with our best theoretical definition of the working class, because it's such an amorphous term. And it deals with class identity and class politics, and all of these things are huge cans of worms, but consciousness and how we relate to the world around us. But this also that question of needing a definition feeds into the idea of, let's say the NDP, and particularly socialist candidates and the NDP win over a number of ridings. It's almost like we need that working class definition, A, to get to that step, but also how do we continue that after that fact? We know that when Layton was leader, the NDP swept a lot of seats, but what was the next step? How do we build off of any kind of electoral gain to actually transforming the party? And how do we refocus the NDP towards a more helpful definition of what the working class is? Yeah, Jessa?
Yeah, I think the first step is to stop shying away from the language that helps people understand it. I mean, for example, in one of my debates, the first time I used the term, I then briefly explained what it was. I mean, you're timed, so it was very limited definition, but it was just to allow people to understand there's nobody in this room that isn't working class. We're a very impoverished riding, and of course, everyone but the Conservative candidate was part of the working class. So I think stopping shying away from that, building a class consciousness, again, that doesn't have to be done within the NDP. We know there's a lot of great groups out there, Courage being one of them, and a lot of other socialist organizations that spend their entire time trying to let people understand exactly what it means to be working class, and that the system is designed to facilitate capital and to oppress the rest of us, essentially. So it starts with stopping pitting each other against each other, but we need leaders that are going to stand up there and speak this in accessible language and pass policies that make it clear, or at least attempt to pass policies that stand for the working class. So lowering cell phone bills isn't so much as inspiring as talking about nationalizing industry or democratizing the workplace, like we see Matthew Green talking about. So I think some people are out there doing that work, but it just needs to be across the board more consistently.
Yeah, absolutely. A question just came in now that's super relevant to this discussion from Stephen is, how do you balance that need to not shy away from socialist words and language and normalize them in a lot of ways, but how do you balance that with that terrible, tired technique from liberals and the rest of the right wing to label the NDP as radical, impractical, incompetent leftist dreamers? So how do we play that game, essentially? Miles, do you want to jump in?
I think Joel was referenced that the Liberals called him too risky, too radical, as well as a few other candidates in that election. I recall somebody making a Too Fast, Too Furious movie poster parody with Joel and the other radical NDP candidates on it. I mean, at the end of the day, Joel crushed that election, right? We grew the electorate by thousands of people and swept the cabinet minister out of office. So I don't think we really have to worry about being tarred in that way. I think we do have to do the work, however, of, and I don't know if it's important to get into the weeds of like, what does working class mean? I mean, you can have the Marxian MCM or CMC formula, which is a good shorthand if you want. But I think talking about socialist politics and that vision, society, the prophetic vision as Stephen Lewis would have it, and what that means, right? And through that, you are actually talking about working class politics, and however populist you are in doing so, I think, you know, doesn't matter so much as shifting that political reality for folks. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to go to a question about foreign policy now.
Can I just say something on the radical component? I've been in
briefly,
really briefly. Like I've been in a number of condescending like debates with MP Adam Vaughan where, you know, he was like, China and I agree on like all of the same things, but you know, we have a practical plan. And it's like, one, so is our NDP platform, the things we're talking about, if they're so incremental that the Liberals feel like we're basically talking about the same things, and that's how they frame and shape it all of the time, then we're not doing enough. We're not proposing enough. And, you know, I think fundamentally it's not radical to like absolutely have big system transformation. You know, it's like a wealth tax is like, should not be radical. I think so many people, once they start to understand like what that would fundamentally mean, it's not radical. Defunding, abolishing the police, like it should not be radical. You know, I think that there's a lot of conversations that like, you know, more and more we're having that, you know, I would rather be called radical if this is like fundamentally the direction we need to be going.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm going to flip over to, I'll do sort of another blend of a couple of foreign policy questions, but that how do we transform particularly the NDP's terrible foreign policy statements that they've had, especially lately. I know, Jessa, you touched on the remarkably uncontroversial position that you took on Venezuela, but like, how do we transform the NDP in that way? And someone actually specifically flags that our closeness with the United States as well how do we begin to diverge from that? And do we have to become a capital S serious political party and respect the diplomacy between, you know, a crypto fascist state and Canada, or can we come up with our own unique socialist foreign policy that does what we need it to do? Jessa.
Well, I think that's where the grassroots membership is important, and letting leadership know that they're on the wrong side of history. I mean, we can't really we can help also shape Trudeau's position on a lot of these issues. We have to make it socially unacceptable to back, you know, the fascists in Brazil and the United States. We need bold leadership there, but I think that's going to just come from pressure from below. So on the Venezuela issue, we were able to shift the message, although it was still a little blurry, from central. We're constantly working for Palestine, but have not found much success within the party there, nor, you know, our governing party is atrocious. But I think it's still important that we take that stand. And in terms of playing the foreign policy game and worrying about trade restrictions and repercussions from speaking out against some of these leaders, yes, it's obviously a reality, but I think we also have to understand that it's an international socialist movement that we should always be working on. And so when we speak to these issues, especially international issues, we're also speaking to those community members, not just their leaders. So it's important that we provide hope for them, and that they know that they're being heard. You know, the fighters in Palestine, they know that there is movements within Canada. There is a party. Hopefully we can get to the point where they notice that there's a political party that's fighting for them. And whether or not it has traction here in Canada, it does provide a beacon of hope for our international comrades.
Someone else want to jump in on this as well, Miles?
Well, I was just going to, I guess, point out, I mean, social democracy has had a rough history with internationalism and anti-imperialism, right? And I think it's not a new problem, I guess. And there are counterexamples like Olof Palme from Sweden's Social Democrats, who evidently was murdered, and probably because of his anti-imperialism. But I think it's absolutely requisite, that it's necessary that we get beyond that reticence and that hesitance in the party, and our Social Democratic Party or any. But you can see why it's difficult, I guess. I think the NDP already doesn't support very popular policies, or at least to the extent that people would be willing to support very popular policies. It even has trouble sometimes getting behind things a majority of Canadians support. And then there's foreign policy, right? And that's a lot more difficult, because I think we're the most indoctrinated when it comes, and that might be the wrong word, but I think our consent is the most manufactured, let's say, to put it in Chomsky terms, when it comes to questions of foreign policy, right? Like, I think our understanding and ability to, like, even if we are trying to, like, ascribe veracity to reporting from places outside of our own society is super difficult. And so it's a very difficult terrain for the left, especially when you have less than bold leadership, right? Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful at all, but
Yeah, it's a big question. I'm going to move on now to another question that we've got. This is, I had this one in my notes as well, and pardon me, things are moving a little fast, so I forgot your name here, but it's, do we need something like organizing some sort of a left caucus or a courage caucus of EDAs within the NDP? Like, we've been talking a lot about ways to strengthen the EDA and bridging relationships between EDAs that have common socialist values might help, especially at convention, especially during elections, and making a little bit more of a solidarity image that might be harder for the party headquarters to ignore. Diana, would you like to take a first crack at this one?
Yeah, I think it's important. I don't know if it's like, you know, the entire riding would have to like agree, because I think there's lots of, you know, variety or spectrum of, you know, perspectives and values. And but I do think there needs to be better channels of communication. I think that, you know, there's lots of really cool last minute stuff like that happens at convention, like Jessa, you spoke to. You know, we have great skill sets, and we, you know, can whip out graphic design flyers really quickly, but it's like, it would be easier to have some, you know, planned priorities going into a convention, or, you know, even even with candidate search, ways that we can, you know, I know that some of the Courage Montreal folks are working on this, but more locally, but, you know, what does it look like to, you know, it's like, I feel like some of the neighborhood boundaries in Toronto, especially, like, lots of candidates don't live in the riding they run in, but maybe they work there, you know, and lots of other things like that. So it's just like, you know, if you know, like, but that kind of thing doesn't really get, like, communicated to the riding or the candidate search. And so, you know, I think there's lots of ways that we could work together.
Miles, or let's go with Jessa first, and we'll hit Miles.
Well, you know, there are caucuses out there that aren't, your participation in them isn't based on a whole EDA.
Right.
We all know the Socialist caucus. And frankly, I would consider more hidden organization rather than being obvious about it, especially if you're, I don't know how to word this delicately, but it's not always well received when they know the left is pushing en masse, when socialists are organizing together en masse to subvert what the centrists have been doing at headquarters, right? So I think our planning is better done on loose channels. Like Diana said, better connect within EDAs ahead of time, but an official caucus is not always well received, although there's other issues that play into that on the floor. I know. I can see Miles nodding, and we all know, most of us have been to convention and we hear the criticisms, but you know, I am a member of the Socialist caucus, and I take a lot of heat for it. And it's another one of those organizations where it's problematic like the NDP, but it's just another tool to push from the left. But it hasn't been terribly successful on the floor. So I think we have to think outside that box a little bit.
Miles, do you want to add something briefly?
I just saw my brother's comment in the chat, and it's NSFW. But yeah, I forgot the question. Actually, that comment was so jarring.
Oh yeah, there it is.
Oh, the yeah. I mean, look, I think whether honestly, I think EDAs need to talk to each other more, and they don't really have a means to do that. There's like Facebook groups, stuff like this. There are regional councils sometimes, but I don't know how active they are, right? And so it would be great if EDAs found a way to get in dialogue with each other and start to build relationships. And it doesn't have to be like the EDA is all on board with your socialist vision of society, but you want to know who the people are on that EDA that do share your values, right? And certainly before convention federally here in Ottawa, we actually asked Elections Ontario or whoever it was, or sorry, Canada, Elections Canada, for the entire list of EDAs for the NDP and all their phone numbers and stuff. And we just picked up the phone and started calling them randomly, cold calling them, emailing them. So that kind of work, like Courage could actually start doing that kind of work. Nobody's really doing it.
We tried in the Toronto area with like What's It in Solidarity stuff, because Jig made statement at the beginning, and most of it was just really weak.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really awesome action to take, Miles. Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question here. So I'm going to talk about, we've got a couple questions about rural versus urban EDAs. One of them is sort of how do you mobilize and get active in an NDP riding that is in a rural conservative stronghold. So that's definitely Jessa's area of expertise. And also broadly to Diana, Miles, and Jessa as well. how do we navigate the tension that exists between rural and urban ridings, especially as the party navigates election cycles and focuses attention on some and not others. So yeah, I'll start with Jessa to give her wisdom to that, and then we'll move on to Diana Miles, and that will be our last question of the evening. Jessa.
Okay, well, first I'd preface this by saying I wouldn't allow there to be tension between, try not to have tension between EDAs, because essentially we are all working towards the same goals. And like we've said continually through this webinar, that most of the membership is left, a lot of them are socialists. And so even though they are getting more resources from Central, it's best as we see them still as comrades, right? And perhaps leech off some of those resources in terms of chiming in on their town halls or chatting with their organizers to just get some tips and sharing the free resources anyway. It's hard to free up fundraising dollars. But in terms of organizing in the rural communities, obviously geographics is an issue, because the more sparse your population, the larger your riding is. So we tend to make sure that when we do organize events, that we move them around between the hubs that exist. And so there's maybe 3 or 4 towns here in my riding. And so we try to move them around, obviously being more active in the most populous region, and also taking into account different issues. So you have to remember, farmers may not traditionally vote for us, but they are a huge part, and it's a huge part of the identity in the rural community. So you cannot leave them unnoticed and unspoken to. And otherwise, just providing a space in a conservative stronghold where people know they can go to meet other progressives. So we started a chapter of Fight for 15 and Fairness up here in York region. And people were really delighted that somebody was organizing something like that up in their area, because I mean, I lived in Toronto most of my life. When I moved up here, it was a real absence. So just create spaces like that where people can jump in and get their feet wet.
All right, Diana.
All right, what was the second half of the question?
How do we navigate sort of maybe tensions or funding differentials or attention that's placed on rural versus urban EDAs?
Yeah, I only have experience with like the most urban Toronto. All of the tourist sites are in Spadina, Port York, basically. But I think maybe there's work we can do like this, like on a digital format, now that we're all more, used to this kind of organizing that can, cross geographic borders during election cycles. I think there's lots of ways that we can work together, and that, that's something that I, even in, the 8 hours of door knocking a day, like I still was heavily reliant on social media to reach the like thousands of people in condos that I can't reach otherwise, so if there's things like that, I think like we can learn from each other. And I can't speak too much to the rural context, but I know the provincial election, last provincial election, they had like a Toronto specific platform. So, that kind of thing where it's like more local things that, even giving the candidates the trust and autonomy to speak to local issues and be the experts.
Yeah, absolutely. Miles.
My brother there that I think puts it well, which is just articulating and centering our agricultural platform more and speaking to rural issues more, because I don't think we do a lot of that. I think we do focus on sort of the nebulous progressive voter base, whoever the hell that is. And we also adopt some of their thinking too, which actually doesn't translate well to rural riding. So and Courage has actually been guilty of this too, sorry, comrades, but we have, right? Last election when we talked about, like basically took on a strategic voting mentality, in one of the public comments the organization made, it was like, that kind of thinking doesn't actually work outside of the urban core. There's a lot of orange-blue voters outside of your city. People are complicated and they don't exist on this left-right spectrum as you think they might. And well, and the liberals sure as hell don't exist on the left of any spectrum anyways, right? So, so yeah, I think the party has a long way to go. Even Courage perhaps needs to do a better job doing that as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, so before I give my final remarks, are there any final words that you would like to share with us all? No, we're good. Amazing.
Love you all, comrades.
Amazing.
This.
Okay, so I want to thank our panelists, obviously, to start off with, Diana, Jessa, and Miles. You've donated your time and your wisdom, and I really think that this was a great learning experience for all of us here, and not just those in attendance. So thank you. Big thank you to the team at Courage Ottawa for making this happen, particularly James, Julia, Tyler, and Clem for organizing, editing, providing tech support, and general support. And a huge thank you to our audience tonight for joining us and contributing such excellent questions. If you would like to learn more about Courage and how to join our membership, please visit couragecoalition.ca or reach out to our chapter on Twitter at Courage Ottawa. And I dropped our Twitter handles in the chat if you didn't catch that. But if you'd like to hear more from myself or our panelists, our Twitter handles are mquail, Miles Krauter, at Diana Yoon Teo, and at Jessa McLean NDP. So thanks again for joining us, and good night.